When you think of Wild West outlaws, you probably imagine gun-slinging desperados, high-stakes heists, and relentless sheriffs hot on their trails. But rarely do you picture an outlaw becoming a pair of shoes. Yes, you heard that right. Big-nosed George Parrott, a notorious bandit with an even more notorious posthumous fate, is one of the Wild West's strangest tales. So saddle up as we explore the bizarre life and even stranger death of Big-Nosed George. Early days and a nose for crime. Let's kick things off with the basics. George Parrott, also known as Big-Nosed George, was born around 1834. Not much is known about his early life, which makes sense when your primary claim to fame is, well, train robbery and murder. However, it's safe to say George wasn't destined for a quiet life. With a nose that could probably lead a caravan through a blizzard, George found his calling in banditry, joining a gang of outlaws who roamed the plains of Wyoming and Montana. Now, George wasn't exactly the brains of the operation. In fact, his reputation leaned more toward being a bumbling criminal with bad luck. But even a criminal like him could stumble into infamy. And that happened when he attempted to rob a Union Pacific train near Medicine Bow, Wyoming in 1878. The botched robbery. But things didn't go as smoothly as George hoped. In fact, they didn't go smoothly at all. The gang's plan was a hot mess from the start. Their target was the Union Pacific Railroad, specifically a train rumored to be carrying payroll for the railroad workers. Now, in theory, robbing a train sounds straightforward, but when it comes to Big-Nosed George and his gang, things are never that simple. The gang decided to tamper with the railroad tracks near Medicine Bow, Wyoming, with the intention of derailing the train. Their brilliant plan was to loosen the rails so that when the train came barreling through, it would fly off the tracks, and in the ensuing chaos, they could rob it at their leisure. Simple, right? Except, not really. The gang didn't anticipate just how difficult and dangerous it was to loosen and tamper with the iron tracks, especially under the cover of night. As they fumbled around in the dark, their movements were clumsy and slow. Time was not on their side, and in their haste, they made several errors, including not securing their horses far enough away from the tracks. The clanging of metal and the nervous whinnies of horses began to draw unwanted attention. Railroad workers and a nearby law enforcement patrol caught wind of the suspicious activity and immediately went to investigate. Panicking, George and his crew had no choice but to abort the derailment plan. The train wasn't derailed, and they couldn't even attempt the robbery. This left George and his gang empty-handed and humiliated. But it wasn't just the failure of the robbery that would haunt them. It was what came next. As the gang fled the scene, they were pursued by two lawmen, Union Pacific Detective Henry Tip Vincent and Carbon County Deputy Sheriff Robert Widefield. These two brave men were hot on their trail, determined to bring the outlaws to justice. George, desperate and cornered, decided that there was no way they could outrun the law forever. Instead of fleeing, they opted for a brutal solution. Luring the lawmen into a rocky area known as Rattlesnake Canyon, George and his gang ambushed Vincent and Widefield. The gang opened fire, killing both men in cold blood. Their bodies were hastily buried in shallow graves, and George and his crew disappeared into the wilderness, leaving a trail of blood and unanswered questions. This murder marked the turning point in Big-Nosed George's criminal career. Robbing trains might have been a high-risk, high-reward venture, but killing lawmen put a bounty on his head that would eventually seal his fate. The law wouldn't forget this one, and from that moment on, George Parrott became a marked man, hunted across the West not only for his failed robberies, but also for the cold-blooded killing of two officers. On the run. With the law hot on their tails, George and his gang scattered like tumbleweeds in a windstorm, desperately trying to avoid justice. For 2 long years, Big-Nosed George managed to stay one step ahead of the authorities, living a nomadic, chaotic life as a fugitive. He didn't stop robbing, of course. How could he? A man like George had to eat after all. He and his gang continued holding up trains, stagecoaches, and the occasional unlucky traveler they encountered on the dusty roads. But George wasn't just a common highwayman anymore. The murders of Detective Henry Tip Vincent and Deputy Robert Widowfield had changed everything. This was no longer just a chase to catch a thief. George was now a wanted murderer, with every lawman in Wyoming and Montana eager to claim the bounty on his head. The rewards offered for his capture grew, attracting bounty hunters, sheriffs, and even civilians, all eager to cash in on the notorious outlaw. Despite his best efforts to stay hidden, George's tendency to drink and boast in saloons began to unravel his plans. He would get drunk and openly brag about his criminal exploits, including the murders. While this behavior might have earned him a few free drinks, it also proved to be his downfall. By 1880, word of his whereabouts reached the authorities when someone in Miles City, Montana, finally tipped off the law. They arrested him on the spot, ending George's 2-year run from justice. The trial and failed escape. And here's where things get even stranger. After his arrest, Big Nose George was sent back to Wyoming to face trial for the murders. It didn't take long for the court to find him guilty, and he was sentenced to hang. End of story, right? Wrong. George wasn't exactly keen on his upcoming necktie party, so he tried to escape from jail. Spoiler alert, he failed. But what came next? Well, it's something straight out of a dark comedy. The townspeople of Rawlins, Wyoming, were done waiting for official justice to take its sweet time. Instead of waiting for George's legal hanging, they decided to take matters into their own hands. In December of 1881, a mob broke into the jail, dragged George out, and lynched him from a telegraph pole. Quick, efficient, and thoroughly Wild West-style justice. The bizarre posthumous fate. But hold on to your hats, because this story is about to take a sharp turn into the realm of the truly bizarre. After George's death, the local doctors, namely Dr. John Osborne and Dr. Thomas Maggie, decided that George's body would be perfect for some, let's call it, research. If you're squeamish, you might want to skip ahead, but trust me, this is where George's legacy really gets wild. The doctors took George's body for a little science experiment. First, they made a death mask of his face. Then, in a move that would make any Old West villain proud, they decided to study his brain to see if there was something physically wrong with him that could explain his criminal tendencies. Spoiler alert, they didn't find anything. But they didn't stop there. Oh no, why waste a good outlaw's body, right? The next step was, drumroll, please, to make shoes out of Big Nose George's skin. Yes, you heard that right. Shoes. Dr. Osborne, the man behind this macabre act, had George's skin tanned and fashioned into a pair of shoes that he would later wear to his own inauguration as Wyoming's governor. Because nothing says, "I'm fit to govern," quite like wearing a dead outlaw on your feet. Even creepier details. As if that wasn't creepy enough, portions of George's skull were also kept as souvenirs, and his skull cap was made into an ashtray. Talk about going out in style, huh? Move over, Bonnie and Clyde. Big Nose George is here to claim the title of Most Bizarre Posthumous Fate in Outlaw History. For years, Big Nose George's bones sat forgotten in a whiskey barrel behind a local pharmacy, because of course they did. It wasn't until 1950 that workers discovered the barrel during a construction project, uncovering George's remains and reigniting public interest in his bizarre life and death. Today, Big Nose George's skull and those infamous shoes are on display at the Carbon County Museum in Rawlins, Wyoming, where visitors can marvel at one of the Wild West's strangest stories. Lessons from Big Nose George. So, what can we learn from Big Nose George's tale? For one, if you're going to be an outlaw, it helps not to brag about your crimes in a public saloon. Secondly, always beware of the mob mentality in a frontier town. it might just get you hanged from a telegraph pole. And lastly, perhaps most importantly, it turns out the Wild West had a pretty twisted sense of humor. Because while George Parrot's life was defined by his failures as a criminal, his legacy is forever tied to a pair of shoes made from his very own skin. A strange legacy. The Wild West was full of colorful characters, but none quite as strange as Big Nose George. He wasn't the fastest gun in the West, nor the most notorious outlaw, but his life and death certainly left a lasting and quite literal impression on history. From botched train robberies to being turned into footwear, Big Nose George's story reminds us that sometimes truth is much stranger than fiction. And there you have it, the life, death, and bizarre afterlife of Big Nose George Parrot. A tale as twisted as the Wild West itself. So next time you put on your shoes, remember George. He didn't quite fit in with the legendary Outlaws, but he sure left a mark on history. In more ways than one.